Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess play. Today I'd like to talk about the idea of vulnerability. When you talk about evaluating a position, you talk about four main criteria, which are material, king safety, activity of the pieces, and the pawn structure. But when you're talking about evaluating individual piece or pieces, I wrote a book called Elements of Positional Evaluation where we talk about the pieces, and there you talk about things like mobility, flexibility, center control, piece coordination, time as an element, speed of the pieces, and the last one was vulnerability. So a very general definition of vulnerability is the ability for a piece to be attacked or possibly even lost to the opponent's forces. So we're going to talk about vulnerability of each of the pieces. Let's start with king safety. King safety is a special aspect of vulnerability because, of course, king safety is so important that it's part of the positional evaluation, evaluating the entire position. And the king is the most important piece for safety. So king safety has its own name. We don't even call it king vulnerability like we would with the other pieces. So we don't have to talk about that too much. I'll show a position that I did in an earlier video about king safety. And in this position, the material is about even. White has 3 queens, black has a queen, 2 rooks, and 8 pawns. It's black's move, and the question is, which king is safer? Well, if we use the traditional idea that, if you haven't moved the pawns around your king, then your king's safer, and so on, you might think that black's king is a lot safer than white's king, who's stuck out there in the middle of the board. But in this particular case, even though it's black's move, the white king is much safer than the black king because the white queens on A1, B1, and C1 can attack the black king. So the black king is actually much more vulnerable. Now, if we just make one little change and switch the queen on H8 with the rook on G8, I won't do that right here. You can do that at home if you want, and still make it black's move, that changes the relative vulnerability of the kings. Because with the black queen on G8 and the rook on H8, if it's black's move, then all of a sudden, black's pieces have a lot better access to the white king, making the white king much, much more vulnerable because the queen and the king, the black queen on G8 and the white king on D5 are on the same diagonal if we make that change. Okay, so we're not going to talk too much more about, we have a whole video on king safety. So let's talk about a little bit about the vulnerability of the other pieces. Let's go back to a game board here. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between the center game and the Scotch game with regard to queen vulnerability. Let's play E4, E5, D4, E takes D, queen takes D4. Why is this not a very popular opening for white? Well, it's because black has the AWL move, knight to C6. If you don't know what AWL is, it's a really important concept. I have a video or two on that as well. It means attack with something worth less. It's a very specific type of threat. And if you can do an AWL in the opening where you're developing a piece and it forces somebody else to move a piece multiple times, we usually call that winning a tempo. So here we AWL, we attack the queen with the knight, and the queen's vulnerable to attacks in the middle of the board like that. So therefore, the white queen has to move again, and we see that white has to basically lose a tempo. That makes this opening with the queen takes D4 on the center game a relatively unpopular opening. Now let's compare this to the Scotch game. In the Scotch game, which looks similar, after E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, D4, white's attacking the black E-pawn twice, and it's only guarded once. So black has to save the E-pawn, and the best way to save it is to trade it for the white pawn with E takes D4, and of course white's going to recapture, unless he wants to play a Scotch gambit, he's going to recapture with knight takes D4. And now the main lines here for black are to develop a piece and make an attack. For instance, knight F6 or bishop C5 develops a piece and makes an attack. If black instead plays the relatively beginner move, knight takes D4, and white plays queen takes D4, because black's using the principle that he wants to bring the queen to the center. Well, this queen looks a lot like the queen we just looked at in the center game, but it's not. In fact, this line for black is relatively rare to bring the queen to the center like this. And the difference is just vulnerability. In the center game, the queen was vulnerable to the AWL move, knight to c6. But here with the knights traded off, there is no good black developing move that attacks the queen. Black can attack the queen safely with c5, but that's not really a developing move. And in fact, it makes the black d pawn somewhat backward and weakens the d5 and the d6 squares. So c5 isn't a great move here. If I turn on the engine and ask it what the best 3 moves are for black, c5 doesn't even make the list of the top 3. I won't show you that, but I just turned it on to take a look. And if we look at this position, it's only, in the master database for Lichess, it's only occurred 104 times. But how many times has this position occurred with knight takes? This position has occurred 16,647 times. And the move knight d4, which, as I said, is a very rare move, was only played 95 times, which is about 0.5%. So fairly rare move, knight takes d4, because the queen is not so vulnerable on d4. So we're starting to look at the differences in vulnerability. Vulnerability is the capability of the opponent to attack a piece and maybe trap it, maybe win it. Not so vulnerable. Anytime a piece can get trapped, if you buy a book and it has a tactical motif section where they talk about different motifs like double attack and double thread and back rank mate and pins and skewers and all those kind of things, removal of the guard. Usually they have a section on trapped pieces, and if you look at the board, you can see the possibility that the piece might get trapped because it's starting to lose some of its mobility. Let's do that. Let's do a nice trap piece in the opening here. Suppose someone plays the Rossolimo variation. Oh, that's not the Rossolimo variation, that's the Roy Lopez. Of the Sicilian. In the Roy Lopez, which I was going to compare it to, which we just accidentally saw, when black plays a6, the main move in the Roy Lopez is to play bishop a4, where the bishop is pretty safe. But here in the Rossolimo variation, the Sicilian, the presence of this pawn on c5 makes all the difference. Now if we play bishop to a4, the bishop is vulnerable. Why is it vulnerable? Because it's running out of squares. If we ask ourselves how many safe squares does the bishop have right now, it only has 2. It can take the knight, or it can go back to b3. If we take away the option of taking the knight and make it go to b3, then we could trap it completely, and the bishop is therefore quite vulnerable. Let's look at the start of a game. At the start of a game, do we have any loose pieces? Well, everybody has a slightly different definition of a loose piece. A lot of people consider a loose piece to be an unguarded piece. But a king can be unguarded, but it's never considered loose because you don't have to ever recapture a king. So you don't really care whether the king square is guarded. When we're talking about king safety, we're really talking about the squares around the king. We're not talking about the ability to recapture the square where the king is, because that's irrelevant. Once someone checkmates you, if you played one more move and they took your king, it wouldn't matter whether you took it back or not. So the fact that a king is unguarded is relatively irrelevant. Well, so my two differences between an unguarded piece and a loose piece is, one, a king can't be a loose piece, even if a king is unguarded. And secondly, the piece has to be somewhat vulnerable in order to be considered a loose piece. Now, at the start of the game, there's 4 unguarded pieces on the board out of the 32, and it happens to be the 4 rooks in the corner. All the other pieces, if we were to magically drop a piece on top and capture them, could be recaptured, except for the rooks. But we don't tend to think of the rooks in the opening position as being, quote, loose, because they're not very vulnerable to the opponent's pieces. But let's start making some moves and see if we can change that. Suppose white decides to fianchetto his bishop with g3 and bishop g2, and black says, I'm going to play knight c6 and then fianchetto my bishop onto b7. Now we can start thinking of that rook as being loose, because by playing b6, the knight is pinned to the rook, and if the knight moves, white is not just winning a rook for a bishop. Since black can't recapture on a8 with the loose rook, then white would be winning an entire rook. So black has to be careful about moving that knight. once black, let's make a move for white. Let's play b3 and fianchetto over there. And once black plays bishop to b7, now the bishop on b7 is the piece that's pinned. And if the knight doesn't move to a5 or d8 to guard that bishop, if it moves somewhere else, then that bishop is also vulnerable to capture. So we use the word vulnerable to capture, meaning that there's the possibility that you could lose it if you're not careful. So again, we're talking about this concept of vulnerability, a very, very important concept. All right, so we've talked about king vulnerability. We talked a little bit about the queen vulnerability if it's subject to attacks by pieces in the opening or any place. Queens can easily be trapped by the other pieces because you can't just guard them when they're attacked by bishops, knights, rooks, or pawns. Then queens get vulnerable very quickly. The queen's great value actually leads to its vulnerability because even though it has a lot of mobility, which tends to make it less vulnerable because it has a lot of places it can move, when it starts to lose those places and you get those potentials for trapped queens, you have the queen being very vulnerable because all one of the other pieces has to do is AWL, attack the queen with something worth less. And if the queen has nowhere to go, you can't just guard it. So it becomes very vulnerable. All right, let's look at some of the other vulnerability aspects of pieces. Let's look at pawns. Let's clear out a board here. Let's create a new board with clear the board, and let's put pawns on like this. Okay. All right, so we'll create this chapter like this. So here we have backward pawns on the E file, the E pawn and the E3 pawn and the E6 pawn. And I was once writing the 4th edition of my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation, and I mentioned that these pawns were backward, and the editor said that, well, no, in his definition, a pawn can't be backward unless it's on a semi-open file. And I said, no, that just makes it more vulnerable, but it doesn't make it more backward. So what do we mean by that? Well, here the pawns can't advance because if they advance, they're subject to capture by the opposing pawns. And that's basically one of the definitions of a backward pawn, is a pawn that if it moves forward could lose material to pawn captures by the opponent. And so that makes both these E-pawns very backward. But they're a little bit less vulnerable because they're both on closed files, and that means the opposing rooks and the queens could only attack them from the side. They can't attack them along the file. So that shielding makes the pawns less vulnerable. Now, if we take one of those pawns off the board, let's take the black E pawn off the board there and create the chapter. Now the pawn on E3 is equally backward to where it was before. It still has those two black pawns that can capture it on F5 and D5. But now black could put a rook or a queen on the D file, and that makes that pawn on E3 much more vulnerable and makes it much weaker than it would be otherwise. So if you have a backward pawn and you're trying to figure out how much of a liability it is, if it's a backward pawn on a semi-open file and your opponent has rooks or queens on the board, then it's more vulnerable and therefore it is worth less. If your opponent doesn't have any rooks or queens on the board, let's say we have a position like this, and your opponent only has, let's say, a king and a bishop and a knight against your king and bishop and knight. Well, since bishops and knights can't attack that pawn through the vulnerable E file, that pawn becomes less weak than it would be if the opponent had a capability of rooks or queens on the board. So the vulnerability is an important point. The same exact idea would occur with other types of pawns. Let's delete this chapter and create a new one. We'll delete that one. Yeah, okay. And let's create a new chapter. No, we don't want that position. We're going to clear out the board. And we're going to, let's go back to the start. Well, let's create an isolated pawn in the middle of the board here. All right, we'll just throw in one isolated pawn. All right, again, when he's on a semi-open file, he's more vulnerable when there's rooks or queens. It's not a backward pawn now, but it's the exact same concept. If black, on the other hand, does have a pawn on the D file, that doesn't affect whether the white pawn is isolated or not, but it does affect its vulnerability because it can't be attacked that way. So the pawn on d4 is relatively, the isolated pawn on d4 is relatively more vulnerable on a semi-open file. So if you play an opening where you get an isolated queen pawn, if it's on a semi-open file, then it's going to be more vulnerable. Let's go back to our entire board. Let's see here. I think we've got it over here somewhere. All right, so let's play. Let's flip the board. Flip board. So let's say we play e4, e5, e6, d4, d5, pawn takes, c4. We have sort of a c4 line in the exchange French. If black takes that pawn and white takes back, white not only has an isolated pawn, but it's on a semi-open file where black can attack it, so it's fairly vulnerable. Could we have created an isolated pawn for both sides where it's not? Sure. If we look at the same opening and we play c4 and black defends with c6 and we take and black takes, these pawns are, again, the white pawn on d4 is equally isolated as it was before. There was no white pawn on the c file or e file, but the presence of the black pawn on d5 shields that pawn and means that even though white has the same isolated pawn that he had before, because black has a pawn there also, that means that the white pawn on d4 is more shielded and therefore less vulnerable. It really doesn't matter whether or not black's pawn is isolated. Black's pawn doesn't have to be isolated. We could take that pawn off of f7 and put it over there on c6. And if we do that, the black pawn won't be isolated anymore, but the white pawn on d4 will still be shielded. So it has nothing to do with the fact that the black pawn is also isolated. That does make it a opposing weakness for black, but whether that black pawn is isolated or not has nothing to do with whether or not the white pawn is shielded. So we can see with all the pieces, when you protect them, when you shield them, when you give them more room, then they can do better. Let's show how we can make a bishop more vulnerable. Let's say you open up e4, e6, bishop c4. Now that's not a good move because black can AWL you with d5, attack with something worth less, and after white trades off, then white would have to move the bishop again, basically losing that tempo. But let's just pretend black doesn't do that. Let's say black plays c6 and white plays d3, and let's say black just develops a piece, bishop e7. Now if white plays the move b3, what that does is it takes away the bishop's mobility, and when you take away a piece's mobility, it gives it less chance to escape from attacks from other pieces. So in this case, now if black plays, let's say d5 in the center, even if white takes, black would take back with the e-pawn, and white is losing his bishop. So the presence of this pawn on b3 has made the bishop on c4 more vulnerable to being trapped and therefore lost. So by taking away mobility, you raise the vulnerability of your pieces because they have less escape options. So taking away options for your pieces, a lot of times when I teach a beginner and they make a move like b3 in the opening, and I say, why did you do that? Yes, they might say I'm trying to fianchetto the bishop here, but a lot of times they say, oh, I'm trying to overprotect that bishop, or they don't use the word overprotect. They're trying to make that bishop safer by guarding it more. Well, that would be true if black was attacking it with multiple pieces of equal or greater value, like if he was attacking it with bishops or knights or rooks or queens. But when he's attacking it with pieces of lesser value, the AWL concept we keep coming up with, then the pawn that attacks the bishop doesn't care that it's being guarded by a pawn. He's still threatening to win material, and as we said, the bishop is trapped. And it's that pawn on b3 that's the culprit when he does that. So vulnerability is a very, very, very important concept in chess. When pieces are unguarded, they are vulnerable. If they're under-defended, not defended, in other words, if they're attacked once and guarded once, they're still vulnerable to double attacks. So pieces that are guarded more times than they're attacked, like if they're guarded once and attacked 0 times, let's say white here plays knight c3, now this pawn is attacked 0 times and guarded once, it's fairly non-vulnerable. If black tries to make a move like queen h5 all of a sudden to attack 3 pawns, all those pawns are already guarded, so it's not a double or triple attack here. He's attacking 3 things, but since they're already guarded, there's no threats. So therefore, pieces that are guarded are much less likely to fall victim to tactics like that. All right, so if you've never heard of the term vulnerability used in chess, it actually is a really important thing. As I said, I wrote a book called Elements of Positional Evaluation. It's in its 4th edition now. It's published by Russell Enterprises. It was actually the very first chess book I wrote. I won't tell you how many years ago I wrote the book, but let's say I was quite a bit younger when I wrote my first edition of Elements of Positional Evaluation, and I talked a great bit about vulnerability because we don't hear that term very much. So I thought it would be nice to make a video about that concept. So whenever you're playing, keep in mind, are my pieces vulnerable? I think people do that with their kings because they're aware of king safety. But when we're talking about the other pieces, you want to make sure their vulnerability is relatively low. And again, it's not just where your pieces are, it's their aspect to the opponent's pieces, because the opponent's pieces have access to the piece, then it makes them more vulnerable. All right, hopefully you found this interesting and helpful. If you get a chance, tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. You can also subscribe to the channel. You can like the video, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.